through the morning. So first, I would like to wish everybody a very good morning from here in Rome. My name is Mitchell Belfer. I'm the president of the Eurogolf Information Center here. And today it brings me a great pleasure to, let's say, open up the eighth of our series on looking at different issues during the coronavirus crisis. Of course, now comes at a time when in Europe certain restrictions are being released, but nonetheless, I think that there's still an awful long way for us to go before we return to any kind of normality. And it's affecting many different sectors of our societies, be it in security and political affairs, be it in social affairs. Psychologically, I think it's going to have a big impact on people. But today we're going to be focusing primarily on the economy. People have a tendency of trying to separate social affairs from economic affairs. And I know that as a political scientist, we do the same, but there is no separation. And I think that the issue that coronavirus has really illustrated to us is that all of these very important sectors that comprise any state or configuration of states, they're so deeply interconnected with each other. So the health issue has affected every aspect of our societies, and we've realized the interconnectivity not only between countries, but within countries between the different sectors. And so I'm very honored today to have such an amazing panel in store for you. And it also marks the beginning of our work together with Pier Camillo, who will be moderating today's session. And he's joined us as our institutional advisor last week, and we're very excited to have that kind of work together. And so on that note, I won't say more because I will leave something for you guys to talk about. Otherwise, I'm an academic by training, which means once I get started, I'm like a wind-up doll. Once I get started, just let me go. I can talk for hours and hours and hours. So I have to restrain myself from that. And so without further ado, I welcome this panel, and I turn the floor over to Pier Camillo to walk us through today's session. So on that note, I say goodbye, and thank you so much for coming, and we'll speak to you later.
Thank you very much, Mitchell. It's an honor for me to be here. For the first time, I'm moderating an event of the Eurogolf Information Center in my new role as institutional advisor of the center. So I'm very pleased and happy to work with you, all the team, and to welcome our speakers today. I want just to say to our participants, all the audience we have, and we welcome them, that for any question they have, they can write on the Q&A section they can find in our conference. So please don't send your questions in the general chat, but on the Q&A section. So it will be easier for us to answer to your questions in the best way. So today we have a very important and brilliant panel, I have to say. Let's thank Mohammed Al-Suwayed. He's an expert in asset management and equity investment. He has worked in the Transport Ministry of Saudi Arabia as a former Vision 2030 realization officer, and he worked in the field, as I said, of asset management and equity investment. He's a regular voice in the Al Riyadh newspaper and participates in many debates all over the world. Teresa Niemczykova, she is an assistant professor at the Department of International Business at Metropolitan University of Prague, Czech Republic. She specializes in development economics, and her research interests include topics of the current economic development in Africa and the relations between Africa and the European Union. And then Marco Valerio Loprete, he's a journalist at the Italian National Public Broadcast, TG1 Rai, a former deputy editor-in-chief of a very influential Italian newspaper, Il Foglio. He's an expert in public policies, demographics, and economics. So today we chose a very ambitious title, Pandenomics, as a way to summarize what Mitchell was saying, that there is no difference and no separation between the social issues and aspects of what's happening, this emergency, this crisis, and the economic aspects. We are really living in a new way of adapting our economy to the situation we are living all over the world, with a lot of aspects we are dealing with and we have to focus. This crisis will change our way of life and thinking in some way. So the world in 5 years from now will be forged somehow by this crisis. And this is what we want to focus in today. Public and private debts all around the world are set to expand significantly. And so their interests will absorb a larger share of fiscal revenues, for example. The pandemic will induce public opinion to care more about healthcare. Supply chains could suffer a de-globalization effect, and the pressure for a decoupling of Western economies from China will influence the years ahead. So today, with our speakers, we will focus on three main regions: Europe, Middle East and the Gulf, and Africa, leaving other two big players, United States and China, in the background, but interacting very deeply with our region, let's say. So let me start with Marco Valero Loprete, asking him to give us a broad overview of the forecast of what we are living and we will live in next years, especially in Europe and the European countries. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you the EuroGulf Information Center for having me. Thank you for the introduction. As said also by Mitchell and by Pier Camillo, I will try to not to separate economics from politics at all, because I think that to understand well the Eurozone will be in the next 5 years, we need to put those things together. So I will start from economic forecast, the official ones, European Commission, IMF, but then my thesis is that we need to look also to what is happening to politics to understand where we will be from an economic point of view in 5 years. I will use a few slides just to point out the numbers. And first of all, I will start, as I said, from the Eurozone contraction that is forecasted by the European Commission, so the official authority in this place. And that's basically saying that we are, here, as you can see on the right, the GDP of the Eurozone is expected to fall by 8% in 2020, and then GDP is set to rebound by only 6% in 2021. This is in the Eurozone. And this estimated fall, as you can see, is even in GDP, exceeds the amplitude of the deepest recessions of the last decades. So this recession will be worse than the OPEC oil crisis in the 1970s. It will be worse than the global financial crisis in 2009, 2013, 14. But good news is it will be a bit milder, or at least it should be milder than the Great Depression in the 1930s. So this is the impact on the Eurozone, on the GDP of the Eurozone. There's also an impact, of course, on unemployment. And in February 2020, unemployment in the Eurozone was 7.3%, as you can see. That was the lowest level since May 2008, so on the upper left corner. Then in 2020, the expectation is that unemployment rate goes up to 9.6%, and then it will lower a bit in 2021. If we count real people heads, you can see how the number of unemployed jumps from 12.4 million right now to 16 million in the end of the year. So that's quite a big jump. And then it gets lower to 14.4. In the orange section, I put also just to give a comparison, I put the unemployment rate during the global financial crisis, so 10 years ago. As you can see, the first jump was pretty much the same, from 7.5% unemployment to 9.6% unemployment. But then the difference is that during that crisis, unemployment kept growing until 2013, while right now the expectation is that in 2021, the situation will get better. Now, there is a caveat for these numbers. For example, the fact that in Italy, for example, we have right now 8.5 million people, 8.5 million workers that are on a wage supplementation scheme. That's called Cassa Integrazione Guadagni, Straordinaria, and Ordinaria. So basically, these people are being paid with the support of the state, but they're not working. And when we talk, and they're not considered unemployed according to statistics, but we're talking about 1/3 of the workforce right now in Italy that is not working, and it's paid in order not to work. Then after labor, I would like to point to the other essential factor of production, that is capital. And again, this is an estimate by the European Commission that says there will be a shortfall of investments compared to the autumn forecast of the European Commission, estimated at around 850 million euros in 2 years, 2020 and 2021. So to sum up, we have more unemployment, less investments, and this is the perfect recipe to reduce the economics production potential of an economy. Now, all these forecasts have two big limits, I would say. One is the heightened uncertainty of this time, and the other is what I call the homogeneity bias. So the uncertainty, we talked about it before, and of course, future growth will depend, for example, on the length and also the effectiveness of so-called lockdowns. It will depend, for example, on a possible new surge of infections of COVID-19. And also it will depend on the effectiveness of a policy response. And here again, I don't want to bother with too many numbers, but these are the forecast by the IMF. They were put out in the middle of April. And I think they're interesting, not only because of the numbers, but also because in the orange, you see, in the orange table, you see the baseline scenario by the IMF, the one that the press and newspapers and TV shows talked more about it in the middle of April. In the gray part, so the bottom part of the table, you see the worst case scenario by the IMF. So you see world economy, instead of falling by 3%, will fall this year by 6% in the worst case scenario. And next year, it will still be falling by 3.5%. What is the worst case scenario? It's a scenario where basically it assumes that it takes longer to contain the outbreak of coronavirus this year. And it assumes also that we will experience a second wave of infections next year. So this is just to give you an idea of how fundamental is the uncertainty we're talking about, even in short terms forecast. Now, on top of this uncertainty, we have, as I said, this problem of what I call the homogeneity bias. Basically, all the indicators I've talked about, and these are the official indicators and estimates, are referring to the Eurozone as a whole, as a homogeneous territory made up by almost 350 million people. But I think that the main problem is that, well, we shouldn't consider this part of the world as a homogeneous territory, of course. And so that's why we should stop, especially when numbers are so big. We said minus 8% of GDP in this year, as expected. We should stop looking at the numbers and try to look more into the number, into what averages seem to say to us. And this is really important, especially in the Eurozone, where we have different states that decided throughout the last especially the last 2 decades, to pull together not only resources, but also rules for the markets and important policies, such as trade, for example, and monetary policy. And looking into the averages I've talked about, into the numbers, we would find out that the Eurozone is basically experiencing, of course, a symmetric shock, as it has been said, but also this symmetric shock, this is the pandemic, is having already now an asymmetric impact and a very asymmetric recovery for the economy. Why this asymmetric impact and recovery? Well, there are many reasons. I will come back on those maybe later on a second round of the talk. But for example, the stringency and efficiency of containment measure have been already affected in many countries by the previous vulnerability of the healthcare system. So we've seen countries such as Germany in the Eurozone, which has many more ICU beds in the hospitals, and that helped compared to countries with less ICU beds in hospitals. So Germany has 5 times the ICU units than Italy, for example, and that helped throughout the health crisis. Then there's also the problem of fiscal capacity, and fiscal capacity among countries, fiscal room to maneuver. Here, what I put in this chart is the fiscal response as studied by the Bruegel Institute, so a Brussels think tank. And I've selected a few data from a few countries, basically the first 4 economies of the Eurozone, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And as you can see, fiscal stimulus dimension is really different when it's analyzed and with this actually 3 categories of fiscal measures. So immediate fiscal impulse, deferrals, and then other liquidity and guarantees provisions. As you can see, Germany, for example, as an immediate fiscal impulse, is pumping into the economy almost more than 10% of its GDP. And it's playing in a different league compared to France and even more Italy and Spain. So again, this is another asymmetry that we're looking at right now, and that average numbers don't show us. And then finally, I would like to say that also different economic structure influences the way we will come out of this crisis. So sectoral effects, the fact that, of course, tourism and services are much more severely hit by this pandemic than manufacturing. And again, tourism and services to the person are more concentrated in peripheral countries than in Germany or the Netherlands, for example. Then also it's important to understand that the share of temporary and self-employed workers is different among countries in the Eurozone. Italy, Spain have many more temporary workers, self-employed workers. They are, for example, the harder to help during those kind of crises. They're harder to reach by the government help. And then also the last factor really important is the size of firms. Italy is, of course, a country with many small firms that employ a lot of people, and small firms, again, are the ones who are more severely hit by the crisis. They tend to be more in debt, and they're also harder to help and to be reached by government help. So this is just to give you an idea that one of the reasons when we look not only at average numbers, but we look at specific difference in the Eurozone, we understand why the pandemic and its economic impact will likely deepen the north-south divide in Europe. Uneven recoveries from this pandemic are expected to exacerbate differences and make political tensions grow in the Eurozone. Why? Because an uneven recovery probably will foster, for example, calls for more solidarity from Italy, Spain, France, more solidarity in the form of fiscal help, funds, assistance, Eurobonds, more monetary easing. But these requests might be frustrated from other states, the states that will come out better from this crisis, such as Germany. And we had exactly 1 week ago, last Tuesday, we had one possible and alarming clue of this tendency when the German Constitutional Court said basically that the quantitative easing put out by the European Central Bank is illegal or has at least some illegal aspects. So in the medium term, if history teaches something, the economic impact of the pandemic might exacerbate and interact with these divisions. And the response from member states, and especially from Brussels, will be really important, will be crucial to understand if in the next 5 years, we will go through something that already happened in the Eurozone 10 years ago. That means a loss of trust among member states. So to sum up, I would say that, of course, today uncertainty, as this graph is showing, is on the, as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, you see uncertainty as tracked by this World Uncertainty Index that is really rising. And, but we should remember, as you can see in the middle of the chart instead, that the Eurozone, the Europeans are really good in inflicting upon themselves more political uncertainty than needed. And in 2001, 2014, the Eurozone crisis created more uncertainty than, for example, was created by Brexit and US election in 2016. So this is, I think, something relevant we should remember. And so here is one more reason to argue that along with macroeconomic indicators, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, we should look at politics among states and geopolitics among European states to understand where we will be in the medium term. That means in the next 5 years. Thank you.
So thank you, Marco Valerio. This has been, at least for me, but I think for everyone, a very interesting overview. First of all, one point is that the length of the lockdown will influence deeply the scenario we will live and the possible new wave of contagion. This is something that we have to sum up in this way. Many people tend to say that we shouldn't focus on the healthcare aspects of this crisis, on the emergency aspect of this crisis, but we should focus on the economy too. Actually, to focus on the economy, we must focus on the health aspects, because as long as we are living in this uncertainty period, as long as with a very huge contagion and waves, we can't go to a new normal. So that's why the first question I will ask to Mr. Al-Suwayed is the economic and social measures that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are taking to cushion the fallout from COVID. What will be the COVID midterm impact on regional international trade? And what do you think the European Union and the different European countries should do to help the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia as the main player of the region to push forward their transition? We entered this crisis with a very concerning turmoil in the oil sector. Let's say that we were experiencing and watching a kind of price war before the crisis, and during the crisis, this problem is still there, even worse. So period of time is teaching us that the diversification strategy that you are already implementing is more needed and crucial for the future, I think. So I would also like to have your opinion about that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Share with you as many information and discuss with you the impact of the economic fallout. I mean, that was caused by the COVID-19. You got a very interesting question about, like, first, how did the Saudi dealt with it locally, and then how we were been engaged in this dilemma internationally through to the oil markets and other aspects as well. So, such as the G20, which is we're already involved in. We were supposed to have it this year. Let me tell you something about what the Saudis did as early as the problem started, the crisis. The healthcare measures that were taken in place was pretty amazing. Saudi was like one of the first countries that actually implemented a quarantine and not a total lockdown, but like an initial lockdown, and it helped that a lot and kind of like deal with the spread of the virus. And then things escalated when the spread happened among the foreign labor workers, and things got a little bit different with the spread and all. But still, the measures that was implemented was great in terms of controlling the spread and all. And then there was the stimulus spending packages that were approved right away. I mean, usually programs such as these, the normal times, it would take longer time to get approved and all. But now it was amazing that we saw how within a few weeks there was stimulus program was about 226 billion reals, which is about $32 billion. It was approved to help with two main problems. One was related to the whatever anticipated liquidity problems, and the second was to help out Saudis and reduce the unemployment rate among Saudis. The amount of that stimulus was about about 9% of GDP. You see, that's how big it is. And if you think about it, really, I mean, it's going to be really effective because most of the labor force that's actually participating in the economy comes from the public sector, not the private sector. As of today, the labor force is about 12 million. 3 out of them, like in the private sector, 3 out of those 12 million are Saudis. The rest are like foreign laborers. While you get and all of this private sector laborers only participate about 300 billion reals in employee compensation within the GDP. And when you compare it to the public sector's employees' compensation as part of the GDP, we're talking about nearly 500 billion reals, which is like almost twice the number of the private sector. And if you take in consideration the transfers that takes place by foreign workers outside Saudis, which all 120 billion. So that means the economy, sorry, the economy relies mostly about 70% of the personal income comes from the public sector, which is kind of stable. We don't expect any considerable changes in the next few years, even with the austerity measures that were announced lately. So if we think about it, the measures that were taken in Saudi, and it was the 226 billion is going to be more effective. 70 billion is going to the private sector, where between employees, institutions, and investors. 50 billion is going through SAMA, the Saudi Monetary Agency, which is going to help the liquidity in the market. And another 50 billion is going to be rushed and expedient payments by the government to contractors, so that kind of help with also cash flow for companies and institutions to not get in trouble during and all this. This is for the next 3 months from the start of the program. And 47 billion is going to be for healthcare. And this is just from the stimulus. More money is coming from donations, charities, to a special fund that was made for healthcare is going to be added to that as well. and then 9 billion for the unemployment compensation. It's called SADC. So this is kind of like what it looks like for the economy in Saudi, how this so you see, it's not really, and it's only related to the luck, which we see that it's starting to be eased, and it should be eased more the next few weeks, hopefully, inshallah. And they will like kind of like lift it up, lift it up in the next few weeks, hopefully. So, this is in a glance of what exactly like it's happening right now. But if you think about it, like now that we're about to go into contraction in the economy in Saudi this year and probably the year after, this would be the second economic contraction in the non-oil sector within the economy since the 1980s. And that could give us actually a better picture of what exactly is happening within the economy since that time. The most of course, we've seen a different contraction within different contraction periods of expansion within the economy, the GDP since the 1970s. But that's all due because of the oil revenues being a big chunk of the economy. But if you separate that from the oil to the from oil section to the non-oil section of the GDP, you really realize that the economy in Saudi went into contraction a couple of times. One was in the 1980s, and this is going to be the second. So this is like impressive how, between those two periods to see such contraction. So that kind of like summarize it, and then we have the another issue with this year's financing, which is the new fiscal austerity measures. During the first few weeks of the COVID, the anticipation was that the financials. I'm trying to figure out. I was like looking for the right words. The deficit this year is like is anticipated to actually grow more than 200 billion riyals. And some of the reports were talking this year that it would actually go beyond 300 or 400 billions. I'm still talking riyals. So what the Saudis actually did to counter that, to actually deal with it, was to reallocate some of the funds, some of the assets, and reduce the part that actually correspond with the amount that was spent for the stimulus. So, and at the same time, there was a raise in VAT tax of 15% for this year, the couple of years after, to actually offset the loss in revenue from oil that was anticipated. So all these measures is to keep the fiscal balance tamed and not like go beyond what was expected to be in terms of spending and in terms of revenues this year and deficit. And hopefully all this, we're looking at all this, that it's, until now, that it's going to be good for this, for the economy this year. Again, just to paint a better picture or a big picture on the situation, the measures that we're taking and the raising in taxes, they kind of look contradicting to each other, but like behind all of this is that the personal income or the consumer spending is based mainly on public workers or public, employees, because that's what's been helping the non-oil sector and the economy grow all these years, because it's been, as well as, of course, the capital expenditures that's been taking place in the past. But all of this been helping in building that non-oil sector in the economy until today.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm not an enthusiastic in general as a state of mind, but I really think that what's happening now in terms of modernization and the awareness of people about what's happening is an opportunity for the future of a country like Saudi Arabia. You're experiencing these austerity measures, and I'm amused about that, because in Europe we are living in this set of mind of austerity since few decades, and I'm wondering what's the sentiment of people in Saudi Arabia about these measures. I think that it's the first time they are dealing with something so different in terms of taxation, in terms of cut of public expenses. But this is also a time when our economies, and I think that at such extent, Saudi Arabia, with such an important touristic sector, for example, and Mediterranean countries that have, as Marco Valerio said, tourism as a key part of their GDP, must think how to diversify their economy. Every crisis is an opportunity, and so we are living now a very important opportunity to go forward and not to rely on what we think we have as a gift. Tourism for Italy, oil for Saudi Arabia, and try to diversify our economies. This is an opportunity, not only a crisis, I think. I have a question from Riccardo Mazzucchelli. Good morning, thank you for yet another amazing webinar. Quick question to Mr. Al-Suwayed. In the coming future, would you foresee governments with sufficient financial capability to engage in more or less foreign direct investments in developing countries? So this is a question that helped me to link your speech with Teresa Nemchekova's speech about what's happening now in developing countries and in Africa in particular. We tended to say that this century will be the African century from a demographic point of view, from economic point of view, and every country is interesting in Africa. China is so interesting in investing in Africa, and also Europe and Saudi Arabia, for example. So I will ask Mohammed to answer this question later, if he thinks that Saudi Arabia will be more or less interested and capable to invest in developing countries in the next few years. Mm-hmm. And I will give the floor to Teresa to ask them what's happening in Africa at the moment. Are they dealing or not with this COVID situation in a proper way? What should we expect for the next months and years? Thank you.
Okay, so hello to everyone. And also I'm very grateful to be here to join you today for this session. And greetings to everyone from Prague, from the Czech Republic. When it comes to Africa, I totally agree with Marco Valerio, what he said at the beginning market at this moment. And if we want to say something about what's going to happen in the nearest future, we basically need to have some data to predict what is going to happen. And that's basically what we lack at this moment. And when it comes to Africa, it's a constant problem that the data on Africa are not that much sufficient. So I would like to say this note at the very beginning, because that needs to work with. When it comes to Africa, the situation with the COVID-19 is not that bad in a way that the WHO is saying that the number of infections is something around like 65,000, which compared to the size of the population is not that dramatic. And the number of deaths so far, the official numbers are something like 2,300-400 people. Of course, there is a lot of questions behind to do the massive testing, to which extent we really know what is happening there. In this sense, the predictions by the WHO for the nearest months in Africa are pretty much grim. The estimations are that this continent is basically at the beginning of the pandemic. So that's a slightly different situation to what we experience now in Europe, for example, when it seems that we have been coming over until the end of this year, it could be around like 45 million of people infected by this virus in Africa. I think what is important to say is that to some extent Africa has advantage compared to Europe, for example, or other regions. And I think this advantage is in the experience that they have with pandemics of this type. It is not the first time that we experience any pandemic in this region. The most recent one was with Ebola, for example, a few years ago. And we have seen that some of the countries really managed quite well to cope with this. So what we have experienced recently was that some of the countries adopted quite efficient and quite quick measures. I'm talking mostly about countries in West Africa, like Ghana, Senegal. I'm also talking about countries in East Africa, like Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda. It seems that these countries really were prepared for this situation. Senegal, for example, was one of the first countries in Africa which came up with the own testing kit for the virus. So that shows that the continent has gone through some, let's say, progress recently. But of course, the rising issues and concerns when it comes to the current situation and the nearest future is how the health systems will cope with potential outbreak of this virus, because there are some other countries which are not ready for this. We heard the stories that some hospitals are not even having some ventilators and this sort of equipment that is needed to deal with the patients who are having this virus. So this is the situation when it comes to, let's say, the current situation in relation with the pandemic. And when we want to think about the economic consequences of this, I think it is quite clear, according to the numbers, that Africa goes into recession, economic recession this year. I think it's quite important to say that the continent has experienced so far quite successful period when it comes to the economic development. There has been at least 20 years, maybe 25 years of more or less stable economic development, also progress when we measure the GDP, when we measure the GDP per capita. We have seen that there has been really improvement. So that's a little bit like a negative sign that what will happen now. And I think there are two aspects that we need to think about when we think of the economic consequences. One of them is that some of the countries really adopted really strict measures. I'm talking about countries like South Africa, for example. I'm talking about a country like Morocco, which accepted really tough lockdown. They completely locked down the economies at the very beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic. They even send out police and military to the street to control the movement of the people. So that was really tough. But we have to understand the African countries or economies are slightly different to European ones. There is a huge share of informal sector, people who are very vulnerable to any shock in the economy. I just found out that the UN is estimating that there could be something around like 2 billion of people in the world living in this informal sector. And it could be around like 1.6 billion of the people globally who have been affected by different types of lockdown recently. And I think that we have to understand that these poor people, these vulnerable people, basically give up more than the rich people when such situation comes, because they normally depend on their daily income. They need to go out to the markets, to the streets to sell some products, to get the money to buy the food for the family. So I think that will be, or this issue, the issue of the informal economy of the really vulnerable people, and we don't know exact numbers, what is the share of the population in Africa that basically lives under these conditions, but we can only assume that these numbers will be high. So that will be the major problem in the nearest future. And we don't have exact data, what's going on actually on the ground. And the next one that I would like to point out is that Africa is pretty much linked to Europe, to the United States, to China, and to other countries. So even countries which have not adopted these tough measures and they did not lock down the economies, they will be definitely affected by what's happening in Europe and in other regions. I can only mention, for example, remittances. There are many countries, many people in Africa who are dependent on remittances coming from Europe, from the United States, from other countries in the Gulf also. And there are some predictions that the remittances on a global scale could go down by 20% this year, which could be like really significant drop in income, especially in combination with all the lockdowns in those countries. I can also mention tourism. Tourism is basically frozen at this moment. I just looked for data for Morocco, because Morocco is or has become the largest recipient of international tourists in Africa. So they expect that the drop in tourism this year will be almost like 100%. They basically do not expect any touristic season because they are also severely affected by this virus, and the lockdown in Morocco has been really like tough, and it's still going on. I think the predictions at this moment are that around like 20th of May they should start lifting up these measures. All I want to say that they will definitely face the internal problems when it comes to handling the situation with the most vulnerable people. And we know that the majority of Africans are still the most vulnerable people. And they will also have to face with the impacts coming from outside. That's maybe also related to the question that was given to Mohammed before, to which extent this situation will influence the richer countries when it comes to the investment in those less rich countries, let's put it this way. So that's also like important question to ask, because that will be also affecting the nearest future of these countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think the question is an important question, and I will ask Mohammed to answer on live. And this is related to something we are trying to put on the floor on this seminar. There is the risk of a decoupling of the economies in the world. Many countries are trying to think that they have to rely on their internal market more than on the external trade and market. And in this situation, it can be that foreign investments can be reduced. And for continents, regions like Africa, this can interrupt a pattern for the development they were having. At the same time, every situation, every change is an opportunity. To develop internal markets means to diversify economies, means to strengthen societies, and this is something that we have to focus in to. So I would like to ask to Mohammed to answer to the first of the question, and then actually we have other two questions for him. There's another one from Bushra Nasr for him. Question to Al-Suwaidi. I might have missed it, but what is the percentage of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia? Is there any supporting fund for those foreign workers in Saudi Arabia since the lockdown prevented them from going to their private businesses? Second question, how does he see the contraction in the Saudi Arabia economy effect on the Middle East economy in general? Can you please,
All right.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I was like, well, excellent. These are really excellent questions. So let me just say something, and let's listen to it carefully. And this is not trying to be positive on the situation. I'm gonna lay it down to you. Saudi is not really in trouble in this time with the fall of the oil prices. In 2015, there was a really great reform program to the fiscal budget. Before 2015, I just want to explain that. So before 2015, Saudi was bound to the oil revenues. So they would only increase the budgetary spending if there is more oil revenues, and they would reduce it if there's less oil revenue. Right now it's completely different. So it's like the link has been separated, and the measures that we have and the decisions that we take, whether to implement an austerity or an expansionary policy, is purely based on our Vision 2030 goals. It's not on our resources. Of course, it's not on resources, but it's based on the goal is that we don't want to waste all of our resources just because we have them. So right now, we are actually capable of not going into an austerity fiscal policy. We could go on expansionary policy for the next 5 years. But the only reason that is stopping us from doing it is that it's going to deplete our resources quickly. So we're taking it really carefully now to put priorities to whatever we're spending at, and also making sure that our finances are sound, just in case things get really bad. So I think the austerity policy the fiscal policy that we implemented this year is not going to affect the foreign aids to countries in Africa or anywhere else in the third world. Actually, Saudi has already committed to more donation this year, especially to the COVID Global Fund and also so many other funds and many other programs. You can see it; it's publicly there. And I don't see any reduction in that, because it's not really a big part of the budget, and it's not a portion that we would neglect easily, because we have an international plan to actually has been implemented for the past 30 or 40 years, and we're continuing doing that as much as we can. That's what I think. And so the budget and the measures and everything are just done because we want to be in a good position fiscally. We're being more fiscally responsible now with with the economic turbulence, and that's it. So I don't think we have any trouble continuing whatever aid programs that we have, and we've already proved that through the G20 meetings and statements that we already made some calls to actually continuing the global support for those poor countries and all that. So that I hope this answer the question properly.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer for the second question from Nazar?
Yes. Well, she was asking about the foreign workers. The percentage of foreign workers is huge in the private sector, not the public sector, because it's like we're talking about. Out of the 12 or mostly 13 million, only 3 million are Saudis. So you can see the majority, probably more than 70% of foreign laborers. And what's been happening to them right now is that they're being provided a free health care, even not just to the legal immigrants, also to the illegal foreign laborers is being provided to them without trying to kind of like deal with the pandemic. And there are many also aids to those foreign workers that help them go back home. So kind of like the measures to help them during this time is already there. So it's already being implemented. We don't have any problem with that. And they don't own their businesses, the most like, so I don't see like they're being like hired under certain conditions, and they're just employees, so they wouldn't have any trouble like not going to work, but they're being mostly being paid or getting their compensation for whatever that they're doing over there.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask to Marco Valerio Loprete to help us in answering another question, and then starting his second round of speech from Axel Müller. Thank you for a very interesting and insightful panel. I would like to ask a very broad question. So given the already shifting balance of power in world economics before the outbreak of the pandemic, mainly between China and the US, but also looking at the Saudi Arabia and the EU, do you deem it likely to have a deepening change in world economics, such as thoroughgoing adjustments within IWF, WTO, or the World Bank, or possibly a substitution or the latter by new institutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Thank you. This is a very broad question. Every one of you, of course, is welcomed if they want to have an answer to this. So, Marco Valerio.
Yeah, well, of course, very interesting question. It's being debated, and scenarios are, I would say, at least two of them I can see. One is the substitution effect, where the speaker was talking about. So that means a new set of international institutions such as the Shanghai Cooperation. But also what I'm seeing right now in the shorter term is that contemporary international institutions, let's think about the WHO. They are, first of all, suffering from a crisis of legitimacy. And so I think that will be the first impact, crisis of legitimacy of contemporary international institutions such as WTO, HO. I'm not sure that China-centered international institutions might get advantage of that, because Chinese posture is also causing fear in many of the neighboring countries. Let's think about Vietnam, let's think about Japan. So even many Asian countries, I think, would think a lot and before getting into China-centered international organizations. So maybe we will be stuck in a phase where international institutions are less and less legitimized, less and less useful, and we go back to a transactional and nation-to-nation dealing. I think that would be also a scenario we should talk about. Now, if I can add something to what I was saying before, I'm glad that both Teresa and Mohammed, when they talked about Saudi Arabia and the African outlook, they both mentioned the sectoral division of their economies. So Mohammed said non-oil sector, and he stressed the difference between non-oil sector and oil sector of the economy. And Teresa also said about the different how important is informal sector to understand the impact of COVID, tourism sector. So, sorry, yeah, I just wanted to go back 1 second to one thing about the Eurozone and how this is going to affect the Eurozone growth in the next 5 years. I will show again just one slide here. This is the asymmetric growth we are expecting in the Eurozone. So on the left-hand side of this graph, you see Germany, and that's the GDP growth. The light blue bar is the GDP growth that the European Commission is expecting between the last quarter of 2021 and the last quarter of 2019. So Germany on the left side is growing. While on the right side of the chart, always look at the light blue bars, you see all those countries that will, in the next 2 years, lose more and more in growth term. So you have Italy, you have Spain, you have Greece. So again, this is what is happening according to the EU Commission within the Eurozone. We're having diverging paths of growth already in the next 2 years. And that, of course, depends a lot on sectoral effects, sectoral differentiation of the economies. As regard to this sectoral effect, of course, we've been noticing already now in the first few weeks of this pandemic that the sectors most at risk include accommodation, food and services, retail, and tourism, of course. And those are the sectors that are more present in Italy, in Spain, in Greece. So these are the countries that will be hit the most. And also, let me go back to Teresa talked about the informal workers, where in the Eurozone, that's not the main issue, but there is a different issue about the share of self-employed workers and the share of temporary workers within the economies of the Eurozone. And of course, in these same sectors that are the most hit by the pandemic, so tourism, services, retail, you have the higher share of temporary workers and self-employed workers. And they, again, happen to be more present in periphery countries of the Eurozone. And again, small firms are also more present and they employ more people in the peripheral countries of the Eurozone. Just to give you an idea, small firms in the manufacturing sector of Italy, that's quite an important sector of our economy, employ more around 70% of the workers, while in the UK, in Germany, small firms in the manufacturing sector employ 30 to 40% of the workers. So even for the government of Germany, it's much easier to call a few big firms and understand what's going on and understand the way you can help them. While in Italy and Spain and Greece, that can get really hard to do. Again, as you can see, this has an impact on the recession we will see in the next years. See the red line here, the brown line, sorry, is the COVID-19 recession the European Commission is expecting for these countries. And again, you see Germany on the left-hand side is having this V-shaped recovery, much less deep than the other countries. France, Italy, and Spain, they go really deep in the downturn before getting up again. And of course, that has an different impact on unemployment. And Germany on the left side of all this chart is a different story from all the other countries. And because of course, unemployment will go higher, will grow more in peripheral countries. So, I just wanted to make sure I stress this point that when you look at average and when you look at average in the Eurozone, you better look also at what's happening into the numbers, not only at the numbers, to understand the political dynamics that might come out from this splintering patterns of growth. Thank you.
Yes, Marco Valerio, let me ask you one thing. You are an expert in demographics, among other things. And I think demographic factors are very important in understanding the impact of the pandemic in the different countries, but also to understand the reaction we will have in the next years. Can we have an overview of your thinking about that, please?
Yeah, thank you. This is something that we're really will be changing an important aspect of how we come out of this. First of all, many experts, I'm not an epidemiologist, but many experts said that, for example, at the beginning of this pandemic, the way Italy was hit hard by the pandemic, for example, and the way Spain was hit hard by the pandemic, at least at the beginning, was also a factor of the demographic shape. And so many old people, big chunk of the population with a higher, with average, stand together, different family tradition from northern countries of Europe. And that, of course, had an impact at the beginning. As you said, for the future, I think Eurozone, the whole, this time as a whole, is facing really a demographic crisis. We are in the middle of the demographic crisis, and that would affect, first of all, for example, the size of the labor force. And Italy has been losing workers throughout the last 5-10 years already, and especially we're losing young workers, young entrepreneurs, and that changes a bit because there are many researchers, especially in the US, that say that, of course, young people tend to be more creative, tend to risk more, tend to be more entrepreneurial. So that's also something we should look into for understanding where the Eurozone is going, compare, for example, to Africa, but also compared to the Gulf countries. And also this will have a geopolitical impact, I would say, because older populations tend to be more concentrated on welfare, tend to be more concentrated on themselves, tend to look less outside of their borders. And I think this will impact also, going back to the question that we started from, the fact that the European Union might play, which role the European Union will play also in the international arena. And of course, I forgot, but in the short term, this will have a huge impact, and is having already a huge impact on public finances and debt sustainability. So yeah, I would say these are four drivers through which population in the Eurozone and demographic crisis we're living through, with a huge chunk of the population that is getting older and older, and always less people that are young generations will affect the Eurozone.
So what are the possible policies that can be implementing to fight the problems of this demographic winter Europe is going to live?
Well, there are some experts who say that looking at international data, it's really hard to influence demographics with public policies. I mean, it's always harder and harder. Of course, you can mitigate the effects of aging, and especially you can mitigate the effects of disequilibria among a certain population. One thing would be, and in Italy, and we still have room to do that, having more people in the labor market, especially more women in the labor market, and more young people. That's part of the thing. The other, if we take the example of Japan, that's an extreme example where productivity and technology are playing a central role in helping the labor force to keep up with the economic growth. And well, another scenario is the one that Mohammed was also describing implicitly when he talked about the big important part of foreign population within Saudi Arabia. That's a different scenario, and I would so having higher immigration levels in the Eurozone, but that we have seen in the last 5 to 10 years as also political aspects that we need to consider, integration issues that are also really politically relevant for the Eurozone and for every, of course, country where public opinion plays an important role.
Thank you. I think Teresa can help us in going on this issue. When we talk about demographics and Africa, we talk about the youngest continent in the world, but also a continent from where we receive immigrants, and but also a continent which is extinction. So, are you optimistic for the future, Teresa?
Yes, that's true. Africa is considered to be the youngest continent in the world. And the predictions for the nearest future are that they will most likely benefit from what the demographers call like the demographic dividend. I don't know if I can be optimistic. I'm always try to be optimistic. So yes, I'm optimistic in a way that always the young people come up with new ideas and have the, let's say, ability or intention to move the things forward. So in this regard, I think Africa is having some, let's say, brightest future. What I also consider as more optimistic is that the young people have access to new technologies. They are pretty much good with new technologies. And in Africa, for example, Africa is considered as the largest market for mobile money. Transferring the money from one mobile phone to another one. Basically, this technology enables millions of people to access financial instruments that they would not be able to access otherwise. So I think this gives some hope that the young population will have the intention, together with all the technologies available, will have the intention and possibility to move the things forward. So yes, in this way, I'm quite optimistic. But on the other side, I'm quite concerned about the most vulnerable people, because most of the young people also belong to the most vulnerable people. When we talk about North Africa, for example, we see enormous unemployment among young people, but it's not only in North Africa. I think the most the biggest numbers come from South Africa, which is one of the biggest economy in the continent, and the unemployment among the youth until like 24 years is something more than 50%. So that's really worrying. That's really worrying. And these numbers are just the numbers before the pandemic, not the current numbers. So this is what worries me on the other side. Yes, they have young population, and definitely they have the ability to move things forward. But on the other side, the structures of those economies, the availability of jobs is still pretty much constrained when we think about the future of this young generation.
Well, thank you. We have a question by Jack Morgan Jones. He writes, there are 175,000 Sahrawis in Algeria, stateless in the Sahara Desert. They are wholly reliant on international aid programs and the Algerian government. In the case of a worldwide recession, what might the consequences be for refugees in Africa and the Middle East? This is a very broad question. I don't know if you, Teresa, have an answer for that.
Yes. Yeah, that's connected to what I said actually before. It's not only the question of Sahrawis, but it's question of many refugees in East Africa, Central Africa, North Africa. We have witnessed, before the pandemic, we have witnessed a rising number of refugees and stateless people. So even without this problem that we are talking about, the problem was worsening basically globally. So I think there is no reason to expect a significant improvement in the nearest future in this regard. when I look at the reaction of African governments when it comes to some, let's say, economic support or some stimulus packages to the economies, yes, they are in place. In different variations once again. So there is not much support, and I would say that there's rising critics about insufficient support to the informal sector. We see some individual programs like the food packages, for example. I also know that South Africa, for example, shortly after they introduced the lockdown, few days after they released the conditions for realize that these people, if you lock them in slums, in some really like remoted areas or like packed areas, you basically send them to. So there are some programs in place. In East Africa, I've noticed that they also use this mobile money for some cash transfers. So it directly targets the people who are the most vulnerable. So there are some measures in place, but once again, we don't have exact picture of the situation on the ground. We have only selective data, so we cannot say like what will be the nearest future. But in this way, I'm not that much optimistic, actually. I know that there is international aid. I know that there are some programs which are focusing on this, and I hope that the programs will continue and they will focus on the most needed people. I know that even the European Union introduced some financial program for how they call it, like the most vulnerable people, or the people who are at the most need at this moment globally. So I hope that these people will get the attention. That not that the rich world will be too much preoccupied by itself, but they will also think about the, let's say, less fortunate people globally, because if we do not handle this situation, that it can come back in a like more negative
Yeah,
way.
the issue you are raising is a key issue for the future. The fact that Africa will grow doesn't mean that it won't have a disorder inside in terms of distribution of resources, and then people who will continue to look for a better life. So waves of migrants, internal problems in the states, in the African states, and everything is connected also to the answers and help we will be able to give them. In the world where we will try to be more concentrated in our economies, in our societies, can be a world when we focus less and even forget what's happening on the other side of the sea. As an Italian, I see this as a big risk for everything that is connected. So this is something we have to deal with. We are going to the conclusion of this very interesting seminar. We have another question actually by Bushra Nasr. Thank you. Quick question to Marco Valerio, specific and others. What is the effect of COVID-19 on the real estate market? I will ask Marco Valerio to answer later to this question, because I would ask now to Mohammed to tell us what's the most interesting sectors you see for the future in Saudi Arabia. Where should people invest? Let's say very easy in Saudi Arabia for the future.
Absolutely. All right. So before I tell you exactly what my recommendation would be for the sectors and stuff, let me tell you a piece of information, and I would like emphasize on it as well, because I said it already, is that the personal income and the consumer spending is coming mostly from the public worker side of the economy, and it's not supposed to be affected with all of the turbulence that's been happening in the economy, supposedly. because it's making up the most of the personal spending and consumption in Saudis. Like we're talking about about 500 billion riyals mostly. So so whatever like there is investment in this, it's actually selling to the customers directly, that could be really attractive in Saudi. So that's for one. The second is that there's an emerging industry in Saudi for the past 2-3 years, which is in the residential market, real estate. And that's because they were just approved the mortgage industry law and all that. And it just came into play in 2017. And the numbers of new contracts and new loans are really rising really fast. And it should continue in the future because there's going to be more financing to this sector that would probably add more than 500 to 1 trillion riyals in the next 10 years. So it's very promising in the future, residential. And also, as I said, any sector that is related to selling to consumers directly, that could be a really good opportunity. And the best way to do it is to go through the secondary market. It's called NEMU, where they have, it was just recently launched, like less than 2 years ago. And it has all the SMEs that starts listing there, and it's going to be more listing this year and next year. So these are like the two most important, I mean, the most attractive, I would say, sectors to be, or opportunities to be investing in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. We will take note of that.
Absolutely.
But Georgi Popov, we are really going to the conclusion, but we are very pleased to have so many questions. Georgi Popov asks, hello everybody, great discussion. What is your opinion on the thesis that now public finances should be pointed mainly in state-owned healthcare systems instead of defense security sectors? I have my opinion about that. That we are living now a pandemic, we are experiencing a pandemic. We should be cared about that, but we will not live a pandemic forever. And the lesson this situation is teaching us is that prevention is more important than successive intervention. So we are paying a very high cost because we weren't prepared. As technology could be actually. So I think that we don't have to think that in the future we have to shift all our resources to healthcare systems just because we are now living in a pandemic. We have to be very careful in the way we reallocate resources in a way that we are able in the future to intervene fast and efficiently in the case of a new epidemic, a new pandemic, but without thinking that now we need all the intensive care units we are using in this time forever. This would be an efficient allocation. We are experiencing now kind of war economy effect. We are many factories producing masks and gels for the hands. It doesn't mean that it could last forever. Of course, we will have a change in our personal behaviors, but I think that war economies should go back to normal economy, maybe a new normal economy, but I think this is an important point. I don't know if you have any comment about that. I have a question for Marco Valerio about the real estate market.
Yeah, well, first of all, starting from what you were saying, I totally agree with you. But the question posed by Georgi Popov will assume different weight in different regions. As I was saying before, in a Eurozone, for example, with an aging population and also with a population that historically is prepared to be under the umbrella of the NATO alliance, I think that question posed by Georgi Popov will be posed more and more often. So people will ask, public opinion will tend to ask for more spending in the public sector, in the healthcare sector, than in defense spending. I think their answer might be different in a country as China, as we are already seeing, and we will see what happens, how the United States will answer to that question. I think that will be really important to understand the next equilibrium on the global scene. But in Europe, I totally agree that I think the answer will be more and more, yes, we should spend more on healthcare, and no, we should spend less on defense. I'm not sure that would be the right answer, of course. Real estate, I have to be honest, I'm not an expert on that. There are specific experts, so I don't want to go too much into forecasting. I would say something, for example, on the Italian market, a few lessons. First of all, right before the pandemic started, we were at the number of transactions, deals in the real estate sector that was almost the same level that before the 2010 crisis. So it was a really slow recovery on that side, but prices of residential houses, for example, was still lower than 2010. And so prices didn't cover the loss yet. Of course, we were expecting a mild recession before the pandemic already in Italy, and that was keeping a pressure on the prices towards downturn prices. I think it would be important to understand how the fall of income of more people will affect the real estate market, and also how international tourism will play a role. I mean, at least in Italy and in other peripheral countries of Europe, international tourism is also important in understanding a part of the prices for real estate. And with the halting of international tourism, that will affect also prices. It depends on for how long. But again, I'm not an expert, so I can't forecast any of this. I was just saying a few factors we should look into.
Okay. Do you have any comment you want to add? Any answer you want to give, Teresa, Mohammed? If not, I will really thank you for your time and for your ideas and all the things we have learned from you today. And thank you very much. And thank you to all our participants for the interesting questions and for their time.
Thank you so much. Again, nothing to say for now. Really appreciate the session, and we're glad to actually share this information and discuss it with you guys. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Marco Valerio. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the invitation and for the discussion. It was great to hear from Teresa and Mohammed, and also thank you for the kind invitation by Mitchell and Pier Camillo for hosting us here. And thank you for really good questions.
Inshallah, next time we can meet in person.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.